good. So anyway, that's how I got involved. So I'm going to pull up some slides and zip through them quickly and make sure there's plenty of time for our conversation. But one of the reasons that I mentioned this, did that come up on the shared screen? Or maybe it did. It might, no, probably didn't, come to think of it. Let me go to the shared screen and pull this up. Oh, looks like you have to enable shared screen, Brian, as the host.
Can you try again now?
I sure can. Yeah, there we go. So let me pull this up, and the reason why I've got this for you is that we all give talks as climate reality leaders. And when I went through the training, I didn't go in skeptical. I've been involved. I'd signed up for the Climate Reality Project probably back in 2011, but I'd never had the chance to go to a training. Finally got a chance to do that. Went to Brisbane, Australia to go through the training, visited friends in New Zealand as part of the trip. But when I went there, I wasn't skeptical, but I didn't realize how inspirational the session was. And of course, Al Gore was there. You've all been through the trainings as well. And he's amazing that he can go for hours without a break talking about certainly climate issues. But we had a heavy dose of climate science and not as much on the human dimensions or even the negotiations. And that's understandable. But as we think about ourselves as climate reality leaders and giving presentations or writing op-eds, whatever it is we're doing, I put some slides in here that might be useful to you as you think about kind of going forward. So let me pull up the slideshow. And again, I'm not going to belabor these too much if I get this to work. Well, the slideshow doesn't want to come up. So, oh, there we go. So you can see it on the screen, I hope. Is that I always look, okay, there we go. So this is just background how I get involved in this. Mediators Beyond Borders, I mentioned them already. And the other part of this is, it might be interesting to you. At the United Nations negotiations, there are 9 civil society constituencies. There are 1,500 NGOs that are accredited by the United Nations climate change regime. And of course, I work with 2 of them. But those 1,500 then sign up to be part of constituencies. I'm on the steering committee of one of them, one of the 9, which is called the RINGOs, the Research and Independent Non-Government Organizations. And there are others too, women and gender, indigenous peoples, business and industry, environmental, a bunch of different youth, a bunch of different ones. So I've been pretty involved in this stuff. And as Brian said, I've attended a lot of the COPs. What I wanted to share with you, and this is again, this is for to put in your files, and you may know this, but if we think about negotiating climate change, a lot of people say it started in 1995 with the first COP. That really started, I think, in 1979, in a way when the first World Climate Conference occurred. The first Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change produced a report in 1988, and the first assessment got together. The panel was set up in 88. And the first assessment report came out in 1990. So we've been at this a long time. What's interesting here, and this is one that I often use with my Republican friends. I remember having a cup of coffee at a Sherry's restaurant up in Lewiston, Idaho, with a person from Orofino who I've gotten to be good friends with. He's a little older than me, very conservative. And I shared this information with him, and his jaw dropped. He had no idea that in 1992, that's when the climate change regime was created. What a lot of people don't know is that George H.W. Bush was president at the time and the negotiations for the UNFCCC started in 1990, only took 2 years. And at the end of the Rio summit on really environment development, sustainable development in a way, the UNFCCC was created, and it was a treaty which the Bush administration supported. He went to the Senate to get ratification. It passed unanimously, 99-0, and then was signed by the president and presented to the UN before he lost the re-election to Bill Clinton. So what was interesting about that is that Republicans and Democrats alike in 1992 all agreed the US needed to play a leading role in these climate negotiations, how the world has changed in 2021. But I tell my Republican friends this, and they say, they didn't know that. They just had this idea that somehow the Paris Agreement was bad or climate change negotiations were bad. We were right to turn our back on the Kyoto Protocol. And I remind them this is not the case, and that something that you can have kind of in your notes, in your files. So 1995 was the first conference of the parties, so we've been at this for a long time. Glasgow was number 26. The Kyoto Protocol was adopted at number 3. And this is just a list of a lot of things that have happened over the years. I don't need to take you through all of them. The Copenhagen Accord was a big deal. Expectations fell way short of what people hoped we would achieve in Copenhagen. And then, of course, there was the Paris Agreement that occurred, which arguably was probably the high watermark in the climate negotiations. And I can tell you, of the 12 Conference of the Parties meetings that I've been to, I think the French did the best job of organizing the COP, of leading the COP, and the French government, along with Secretary of State Kerry at the time, and the president of the Marshall Islands, they played a key role in getting the Paris Agreement done, basically. And granted, it's a relatively vague in a number of areas and still requires a lot of work, but it was still, I think, a really important accomplishment. So what about from Madrid to Glasgow? This is what we want to focus on. What happened in Glasgow? Of course, we were in Madrid. People felt Madrid fell short of expectations. And so people were anticipating Glasgow. And the other part of Glasgow that's important to note is when the Paris Agreement was established in 2015, the idea was it would be fully implemented by 2020. And when it would be implemented by 2020, it would mean that there would be something called the global stock take. Now, that one of the things that I worked with federal agencies, and I thought the Forest Service and the BLM and the federal government generally had about the most acronyms I'd ever seen. No, climate change beats them all. I mean, it goes on, and there are new ones appearing seemingly every year. But the global and there's a lot of jargon, a lot of what we call climate speak that goes on at these meetings. Well, the global stock take was simply a meeting where all countries would report their progress since Paris. And that is happening, and they would update their climate action plans. Now, you may all be familiar with this, and my apologies if I'm telling you things that you already know very well. But one of the things that I observed in the negotiations happened in Warsaw in 2013. And it, again, the US played a key role in this, as well as other countries. China played a key role in it as well. And that was the idea of each country, whether they were developing or developed, would prepare something called an NDC, nationally determined contributions, really initially with the idea of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But the NDCs have become basically national climate action plans. And for some countries, adaptation is much more important than mitigation. And so the NDCs, almost every country, I think 175, had submitted their first one prior to Paris in 2015. And the idea would be that they would be updated in 2020. At this point, I think about 150 countries have provided updated versions of their original NDCs. There are still some in development. The US, of course, backed up under the Trump years. And you all know that. I mean, I don't need to go into detail on that. But what has happened since Paris, and particularly probably since Madrid, I think that, and you can share your thoughts on this from my perception and what I've read and what I've experienced, there's much greater public awareness of climate change as a climate crisis or emergency. Why is that? Well, I think a couple of reasons: extreme and catastrophic weather events and better media coverage than we've had in the past. Public pressure has come around. The work of Greta Thunberg and other young people and Fridays for the Future have made a big impact. A lot of media coverage there. New climate science reports that say that a lot of the climate models have been too conservative. And so there were high expectations, I think, going into Glasgow. And the Glasgow outcomes, this is what I'm going to focus on, and then there'll be plenty of time for conversation. I've been all over the internet, and of course I was there for 2 weeks. The Glasgow outcomes, some people said Glasgow failed to accomplish what it should have. Other people said, you know what, it did pretty well. You can come to your own conclusion. There's a lot of different material to read, but I'll give you my take. And one of the organizations I rely on, I attend their events when they occur. You could sign up, by the way. I recommend the World Resources Institute. It's not a perfect organization. I don't know that any organization really is, but I think it tries really hard to be very science-based. and very reasonable at understanding the complexities of climate policy. And they do a lot of really good webinars. In fact, they did one today with Ron Wyden, Senator Wyden from Oregon, about infrastructure. So it's not simply about climate change, but they do a lot of work on climate change. So when I was going through my notes on Glasgow and reading what other people have written, I'm going to share with you what has been my adaptation or my interpretation of what I read, primarily from the World Resources Institute. And you can go to this link here and you'll see a lot of what are on my slides will come right from their report. So by the end of COP26, 151 countries had submitted new NDCs, but the UN has calculated that when we put all these together, we're going to be on track for a 2.5 degree centigrade increase in warming by the end of this century. And as you all know, the goal for a lot of developing countries is 1.5. And going into Paris, the number that people thought the NDCs would reach was 2.7. So that's been redone to say that a number of countries have increased their ambition. In other words, have increased their commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but we're still at a too high a point in terms of what the climate models tell us. But there is improvement. I think that was the thing that it's kind of like, are you a glass half full person or a glass half empty? I'm an eternal optimist. I like to think of myself as a realistic optimist, but I am an optimist. But let's look at the climate outcomes. One of the biggest issues in all the years I've been studying this, and understandably, is climate finance. The developing countries want the developed countries to pay. Like the United States, China, the European Union, the primary greenhouse gas emitters aren't necessarily the primary victims of greenhouse gas or increased temperature. The most vulnerable countries are among the poorest economically, and the developing countries will say, developed countries, you need to pay. You need to provide the finance mechanisms that's needed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to help us with adaptation. And coming out of Copenhagen was a commitment to $100 billion by 2020 from developed countries. That has not been met. It's at about 80 billion now, and the can has been kicked down the road to 2025, where countries are saying maybe we'll reach 100 billion by 2025. So this is an issue that is still very, very difficult. But one of the things that came out of Glasgow that I think was very positive was an increased commitment to fund adaptation, and particularly again in developing countries, which is their priority. I work with some people in Bangladesh, as well as a number of other countries. Bangladesh, it's a heavily populated country, but it doesn't produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions compared with, again, developed countries. But it's considered one of the most vulnerable countries to the impact of climate change. And so Bangladesh priorities will be more toward adaptation and loss and damage than it will be toward greenhouse gas emissions. Now, loss and damage has become a huge issue for developing countries. And this is an area where a lot of critics at Glasgow felt very short. One of my good friends from Bangladesh is a person named Salim Huq, H-U-Q. You could Google him and he's all over the place. He's a great, great person. And he gave an interview with the BBC at the end of Glasgow and said for him, Glasgow was a failure because it did not sufficiently address loss and damage. Now, the way I explain this to my students is that loss and damage for developing countries really is about what you and I see in our Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. And we know that when there have been wildfires in Idaho, Oregon, Washington, the FEMA trucks show up and they're at the local hotels and they're trying to provide people, like we did in Oregon, with temporary housing when people lost their homes in the fires of 2020. And of course, we see that now in Kentucky and Tennessee and Illinois. We see it with catastrophic weather events, hurricanes, for example. So we have, and most developed countries do have, some kind of a mechanism, some kind of a government agency to step in and provide emergency relief. But a lot of the poorer countries economically in this world don't have it. So they've been advocating for basically an international FEMA. And the US has been one of the countries saying no to that. And that's been a real disappointment, but because the most vulnerable countries, the Philippines, Bangladesh, a lot of the small island states simply don't have the resources to handle these catastrophic events that are caused in part or by these increased temperatures. So this is a big issue, and I think it's going to be a priority issue when we meet in Egypt for COP27. Now, there's been progress on some contentious issues, and to summarize them briefly, one of the most difficult issues since Paris has been an area of the Paris Agreement that deals with carbon markets and carbon credits and carbon offsets. How do we count carbon? And I'm not going to go into great detail on it because it could get us into the weeds, but it's been treading water since Paris. I mean, in Katowice in 2018, in Madrid, and in the meetings that we have in between the COPs that I'll talk about. But in Paris, it isn't a done deal, but some good work came out of this where countries were able to get through the issue of double counting, and there's still some work to be done, but a lot of progress was made on coming up with the rules governing carbon credits. And that's been a real stumbling block because some countries, Brazil, for example, has had a very different agenda than some of the other countries. And one of the things you may know about these climate negotiations, the United Nations is committed to a consensus process, which means if 197 countries have standing at these climate meetings and one or two object to something, it doesn't get done until those issues are resolved. And you'll see that in some of my notes a little bit further down. The Glasgow Agreement, for example, these negotiations spent a lot of time on specific language. Shall versus should was a big deal with the Paris Agreement. The Glasgow Agreement encourages the use of common timeframes. What is that issue? Some countries think they need to report their climate progress every 10 years. Other countries say we need updates every 5 years. They keep going back and forth. So now we're encouraging countries to go with a 5-year plan, but not requiring it. That encouraging had to be in there for people to agree. Another example, if you look at the bottom of this slide, has to do with language regarding the coal industry. You probably read about this, that originally the term was going to be phase out of unabated coal, but India and some other countries, Australia, objected to that. So the language is now phased down. Or another one was phase, and then the language of phase out of fossil fuel subsidies, that stayed in there. And that was a big deal because in all the previous climate agreements, there's been no mention of coal and no mention of fossil fuel subsidies. And at least now that language is in there and all the countries signed on to that. And then there was progress made on the issue of transparency, accountability. That's been a big stumbling block too when you get into sovereignty issues there. And then I think we need to highlight the developments that occurred at Glasgow but weren't part of the internal negotiations. You probably again read about this. 109 countries signed a global methane pledge. 141 countries pledged to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation. 46 countries committed to phasing out domestic coal. And then non-state actors is a term that we use for civil society organizations. 2,000 companies have committed to develop science-based targets for reducing emissions. 1,000 cities and local governments have signed up to the Race to Zero campaign. Again, talk about any of that stuff in detail if you'd like. But I want to close my comments with the kind of questions I often get asked by people, including my students. Why does this take so long? And I have to say, I'm disappointed in some ways year after year. I really thought when I went to Katowice, Poland in 2018, I would see in the negotiators a sense of urgency I hadn't seen before. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had just come out with a report in October of 2018. For policymakers, a summary report saying, my goodness, we've got to get our act together by 2030. I thought I'd see more of a sense of urgency in Katowice, didn't really see it, at least among the negotiators. I saw that among the non-government organizations. Same thing in Madrid. I thought we might see a greater sense of urgency. Starting to see the urgency more in Glasgow than I've seen before. But a couple of things. One is, in all the years I've been following this, the agenda items have increased. So a lot of issues, if you go back to COP1 in Berlin in 1995, there was no discussion of gender. There was no discussion of indigenous people and human rights. There was no discussion of adaptation. It was all greenhouse gas emissions. But over time, a lot of issues have been added, and I think for good reason, but it's made the negotiations more challenging. So that's one thing. A lot of issues, and the issue list keeps increasing. And then I mentioned before, decisions by consensus. The way I explained this, I was doing a side event, a presentation in Glasgow, and I was asked during the question and answer period if why I thought things take so long. And I said, well, the consensus process is very admirable, but I said, here, compare it this way, and I've used this comparison a lot. I want you to imagine for a moment that this summer we get beyond COVID and we decide to bring our whole families together in a huge reunion. 200 people are going to come to this family reunion of your family. It's first cousins, second cousins, third cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents, little kids, everybody. But in order to have this wonderful reunion, you all have to agree on a menu for what we're going to eat. Imagine how difficult it would be to get 200 people to agree on the food planning or the menu for the reunion. We're asking people to basically agree, 200 people or 200 countries, to agree on the climate change menu, if you will. And it just takes time. And it's frustrating that it takes so long. But ultimately, we need all countries to be on board. And of course, the other part is the coalitions operate. There's this view of CBDR, which is in the original treaty, common but differentiated responsibility. What does that mean? And of course, there are issues like loss and damage that are very important to some countries, less so other countries. And then, of course, issues of indigenous voices and human rights have become very, very important. So what about beyond Paris and Glasgow? One of the things I want to mention is that a lot of the work does not occur at these end of the year meetings, Glasgow, Paris, wherever. They occur in other venues. I love going to Bonn, Germany every May or June. I've been doing that since 2010. Why do I enjoy that? Because that's where a lot of the negotiations really occur. That's where a lot of the negotiation teams really make progress. And as a result of what happens in Bonn in May or June, something we call the intersession, our recommendations then go to the COPs and get considered by the environment ministers or the head of delegations. So if you ever wanted to really observe the negotiations, I think going to these intersessions in May or June in Bonn, you're going to see more. Plus, the negotiators are more accessible. I can go up to them after observing a negotiation and say, do you have time for a tea or a coffee? And more often than not, they'll say yes. And I'll be able to talk to them about what's going on, because my badge as an observer gets me into some things, but not everything. And then there are these specialized meetings. I've been an observer for the last 5 years of the meetings of the Adaptation Committee and the Paris Committee on Capacity Building. Once again, a lot of good work gets done in those sessions. And so the last thing I want to mention, and something that, again, you know well, and you talk about when you give presentations as a climate reality leader, what is it that we can do as citizens? And I don't need to go through this. You know all of this. I always tell my students, and I tell my colleagues, my friends, we need to all be involved in the development of climate action plans in our local community. We have it in Corvallis here. I noticed that Boise's got a goal of carbon neutral. I thought this Bees to Bears project in North Idaho is, at least when I read about it, looked really interesting. Duluth, Minnesota, Chico, California. You can almost Google, especially probably in communities that are reasonably progressive. You're going to see people spending time on that. And as climate reality leaders, we have a lot to contribute, certainly in our local communities, in developing these climate action plans. And I think climate action plans that aren't just about reducing our carbon footprint, about mitigation, it's about also how our communities can better adapt to changes brought on related to the climate crisis. So again, wrapping up, that's really what's happening here. This last slide, though, I often show, we forget that in 2018 sometimes that voters rejected most ballot measures aimed at curbing climate change. A lot of us thought the ballot measure in Washington would pass in Colorado, and they didn't. And I think, again, part of that has to do with misinformation. A part of that has to do with the ability of people who are climate deniers to get a hold of some tag phrases, and certain media outlets kind of go bonkers on that. And so it's up to us as climate reality leaders, as climate crisis educators, to work hard to provide people with the information that they need and in ways that work for them. And I'm going to close with one story. I do a lot of work, as I said, at the community level around forest management, agriculture, water, mining, bunch of things. And some years ago, I was working, actually about four years ago, I was working in Pinedale, Wyoming, Sublette County. You may know that country pretty well, a lot of oil and gas in their backyard. And I was having breakfast with a local rancher. And he was a few years older than me and probably a Republican, although I didn't ask him. For all I know, might have voted for Trump. I didn't ask him, but we're talking about this. And he said, I need to get you out on my ranch. I want to show you what we're trying to do. A lot of people, especially you university types, you may think we're not good environmental stewards. Of course, I didn't say that. I said, no, I'd love to go on your ranch. Well, we went out and the whole time I'm asking him, okay, your family's been on this land for generations. He said, yeah. And I've been running this ranch for a long time. I said, tell me what changes you've seen in the last few years. Are you getting as much rain as you used to? No, we're not getting as much rain. Is it the summers last a little longer, a little hotter? He said, yeah, that's happening. I said, what about the trees? I said, you got a permit to graze sheep or cattle up in federal land. Are you seeing much in the way of beetle kill? Oh yeah, the trees aren't as strong. And I said, do you think that has anything to do with changes in the climate? And he looked at me, he said, you got me. In other words, you and I know this, that we've got to make our message relevant to the people with whom we are interacting, regardless of their politics, regardless of their ideological orientation, who they voted for, whatever. And when we start talking to people about what they're seeing on the ground, what they're experiencing, whether it's Bogus Basin not being able to open as early as it might in other seasons, or people having to ski on human-made snow or artificial snow, whatever it is, or people who love to spend time on the Middle Fork of the Salmon and what they're seeing, relating our knowledge to them, whether it's outcomes from Glasgow or whether it's what you and I have learned through the Climate Reality Program, I think is important. But I'm going to stop there. I've been chatting away too much, and it's time for you to share your experiences, your concerns, your questions related to any of this. And again, I thank you for giving me a chance to kind of preach to the choir.
Thanks, Greg. That's awesome and incredibly insightful. So I'll open up to anyone. Any questions? I have some, but I want to make sure others have an opportunity to ask.
I don't have so much questions, but Greg, I appreciate very much your half full position. I think that says a lot. The other thing that I recognize is you've been doing this for a long time, and I hope that the knowledge that you have accumulated is somehow going to be documented, passed on. I mean, you know stuff that a lot of people don't know. And I think that your knowledge is incredibly valuable to all of us. And so I hope, you sound like you're a young man, you're healthy, and good for you. But
thank you.
I think that I'm hoping that somehow this is going to be what you know is going to be preserved, and the ability to pass that on, because I think it's priceless. So
well, that's very kind. There's one thing I will say about that. As a professor, I'm actually 70 years old, which means I get to ski free at some ski areas now, or get a discount. Yeah, I'm going this winter, but I write some of this stuff up. I need to do more, and of course, my university, they don't care much about me anymore. They'd like me to retire, but I still publish. I still write articles, and I want to write articles that aren't just for a small academic community. And I think that's Rob, I appreciate that encouragement. I want to add one thing. I am encouraged in part because of my students, and I think it would be true at Boise State. think it'd be true at Idaho State or Northwest Nazarene or College of Idaho. When I talk with my students who are, again, they're 18 to 23, Republican, Democrat, the whole range of political views, almost to a student, they say, we need to deal with the climate crisis. And you know what? I taught a class this fall on conflict management. And we're talking with my students about this because they know I do all this stuff. And they said they don't get it with my generation, the baby boomers. They said, when it comes to issues like the pandemic and climate crisis, these are not partisan issues. The entire country should pull together and work together, and it frustrates the dickens out of them. And I turn back to them and I say, that's why we need you to be active. That's why we need you to be engaged, because they tell me the climate crisis shouldn't be Republican, Democrat, red state, blue state. It should be all of us pulling together and dealing with this issue. Now, Rob, that's partly why I'm optimistic. My students keep this part of me young, even as the body ages. So, other thoughts, comments? Appreciate those comments.
Again, just a comment, kind of like Rob. As someone who is a self-diagnosed cynic, I totally appreciate your optimism and your hope. I was, as you were starting, I was like, that's what I'm going to ask is, why are you hopeful? And so it's just super encouraging to see that you're having these interactions with, like Rob was saying, using your lived experiences and your knowledge as a PhD and just a professor and like how you can incorporate that with your younger students and everything. And yeah, anyway, that's really wonderful. And as a millennial myself, I can say like 100% agree. It is not a partisan issue. It is a human rights issue. It matters to all of us. So yeah.
I appreciate those comments. I mean, I think that's what we need to keep encouraging. It's why we need to go beyond preaching to the choir and try to reach out to people who, again, I appreciate skepticism, and I hope it doesn't turn to cynicism. So
I have a question. Is China considered a finance contributor, or are they a user of the finance for that loss and tragedy fund, for example?
That's a really good question. Sometimes my students say to me, what country negotiates the best? And the answer is China. Because China plays everybody off against each other. For example, a lot of the power in the negotiations occur in these country coalitions. And one of the coalitions is called the G77 in China. And I don't need to go into detail why it's called that. But China, of course, back when Kyoto was established, China was considered a developing country. So it wasn't accountable to the Kyoto Protocol. The US has said for years, especially when we got to 2012 and the Kyoto Protocol was expiring, that if we have a new Kyoto Protocol or we extend it, China's now a major emitter. And that's true. China and India, 1997 versus 2017, very different. But China aligns itself with developing countries when it's in its interest to do so. But it also, of course, will connect with the G20 and kind of move in that direction. It's in this middle ground. Brazil, South Africa, China, and India are in this group called BRIC. And it's if you look at the World Bank, it's kind of in between developed and developing. They often call it emerging economies. So China plays everybody off against one another. On the one hand, it'll say we're number one in solar, and yet they're building coal plants. And they also are not transparent. But in terms of loss and damage, no, they're not part of that. They have internally the resources to handle the kind of catastrophic crises that we may have. So, but they will be very, very vocal in speaking in favor of a loss and damage regime if it serves their interest. So, yeah, China's pretty amazing to watch them work at these meetings. Anyway.
Interesting. So how public are the COPs and the intercessions? How do you get into them and attend them? And the dynamics, I heard some criticisms of Glasgow that there were a lot of like fossil fuel companies that were as part attending as country delegations. So how do you get involved?
That's a really good question. You have to get a badge. And to get a badge, you have to be nominated by an accredited organization. There are basically four kinds of accredited organizations. One of the countries themselves, and the Secretariat doesn't regulate that at all. So if Poland wants to have in its country delegation somebody from the Polish coal industry, they can do that. There are no fossil fuel companies that can issue badges themselves. So ExxonMobil can't give any of us a badge. They're not accredited as an organization. But could an ExxonMobil person get a badge through somebody? like the US, if the Trump team wanted to do that during the Trump years, yes. So there were some people there who had badges through country. So that's one, you get it through a country. None of us could get it through the US. A second one is through media. So you could get you could be an accredited, you have to be accredited, an accredited journalistic organization or media organization. You could get it that way. One, you could get it through an intergovernmental organization like the World Bank, if any of us had access. But for most of us, we're going to get it through a non-government organization like the Climate Reality Project, or like International Environmental Communication Association, or like the Sierra Club. I could give you a longer list. And so what happens then, and this is the way it works. In my case, since I'm leading two delegations, I do the nominations for Mediators Beyond Borders International and for the International Environmental Communication Association. So for example, with Glasgow, for each of the organizations, I nominated 16 people. For Mediators Beyond Borders, I received 8 badges. For the other group, I received 7. And you assign a badge week by week. And so we had some people there for the full 2 weeks, like me, others who were there for 1 week, either the first week or the second week. When we go to Bonn, Germany, for the intersessions, it's also 2 weeks. This year, it's the 6th to the 16th of June. And once again, some people will get badges for both weeks. I'll go for both weeks. Some will go for 1 week or another week. But the key is you have to get a badge through a recognized, accredited organization. Once you get that badge, you get a specific type of badge. And for me, I get an observer badge, which means if at some of the negotiation meetings, observers are not allowed. If any of the countries object to observers in the room, there are no observers in the room. So in Glasgow, that was a frustration. Some of the negotiations I could not get into because observers weren't allowed. Others I could. And over the years I've been going to this, some meetings have been very open. Typically Bonn is very open, but at the COPs, especially when the ministers show up, they want to do some behind the scenes things. In Paris, for example, the negotiations continued into Saturday and we observers couldn't see a thing. It was all behind closed doors. And I teach international negotiation and I understand, well, sometimes you have to do it behind closed doors, but that's how it really works. So if any of you wanted to attend any of these meetings, you would simply need to get a badge through one of the recognized NGOs. So any other thoughts and questions and concerns? And I'm curious what you came out from, what you read in media reports. Did you think Glasgow made significant progress? Or was it your sense that Glasgow fell short of expectations?
I only picked up bits and pieces, and I probably saw Greta on the news basically saying, you know, it sucked. And
yeah,
so,
blah, blah, blah.
yeah, that was kind of my impression is that, you know, yeah, okay, we need to get together. Thank goodness people are talking about it, but, you know, business as usual. So.
Yeah, that's the media seems to portray it as mostly a lot of failures. But I know 2 individuals, one who represented the country of Georgia and one who was a negotiator from New Zealand. And they both had really positive experiences and said how palpable the excitement was inside the negotiation room or rooms. I'm not sure how many, maybe there's more than one, but.
There are a lot of them.
Yeah, and there was this call to action in the very beginning by someone, a British person, I can't remember who they said, but that really, that there was just a ton of energy, a lot of excitement to make progress on climate change. That there wasn't cynicism and skepticism and pessimism in the rooms at all, and that people felt like it was all sincere and genuine. And then I'm like, well, that's not what I'm not hearing that in the media at all. Like it feels like the media was not that, they were not, I didn't hear that. And maybe that's the media that my algorithm is sending me, but.
Well, I've been teaching conflict and negotiation for 35 years, and conflict makes the news and peace doesn't. It's been that way throughout my entire life, and it's frustrating, but yeah, And of course, conflicts get exaggerated. There's a piece that I show. I teach a general education class I developed over 30 years ago at my university called this argument and critical thinking. And I get 700-800 students through this class every year. And I always show this video from last week tonight with John Oliver. And this, by the way, I would show this in a climate reality talk too. It's great. He does this thing on climate change, and there's some profanity, so I always have to apologize to my students for that. But at the end of it, he says, look, he said 95% of the scientific community agrees that we're basically in a climate change is serious, 5%, but the media will give people 50-50. And he shows these clips of CNN or whatever, and it'll be Bill Nye the climate, Bill Nye the science guy. And on the other side is some climate denier. And he said, why are they giving him 50-50 when it's 95-5? So he ends the clip by bringing 95 scientists out to support Bill Nye and 5 scientists to apparently come out and support the climate deniers. And that's really true. But yeah, the media will say somehow these views are equal. Not at all. And of course, we need to get that message out. I do want to say one thing, though, because this is interesting. People, and maybe one of you will want to come to one of these COPs. We're going to be in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt next November, and that should be really interesting. And we go to Bonn again in June, and I'll be there. What's interesting about this is that when people come to these meetings for the first time, and they aren't aware of the intricacies and the complexities of the process, they're often very disappointed that the negotiations don't go faster and make more progress. I understand that completely. But here, I had a number of people in Glasgow who'd never been to one of these before. And I coach them. I serve as a little coach and guide and mentor, whatever. And I said to them, you're going to sit in on negotiation sessions and you might be discouraged because they're going through documents line by line, word by word. It's kind of like watching paint dry. I said, so the thing about these COPs, there are basically 3 parts to every big end of the year meeting like Glasgow. One, the negotiations themselves. But the second is what we call pavilions and exhibits. And so countries like the United States, not during the Trump years, but now that we're back with Biden, we have a big pavilion. China has a pavilion, India has a pavilion, Saudi Arabia, the European Union, the UK, all these pavilions, and there are events going on all the time. And then there are also side events where people are giving talks. I worked with the North Macedonian government where I gave my talk. I co-sponsored an event with North Macedonia about local climate action, for example, and about 40 people were there. And then there are exhibits. So about 200 organizations will have a booth and you can go there. When you go to the negotiations, you can get pretty discouraged because the progress is so slow. But then you go into pavilions and into the exhibits and the side events, and you see all this amazing work happening all over the world. And it's inspiring. It's kind of like going to a climate reality leadership training. You come away saying, wow, we're going to get our act together and address this. So there's a lot of good work happening all over the world that doesn't get reported, at least it maybe in special outlets and on certain websites, but not in mainstream media. And I think, again, one of the things that when I went through the climate reality training in Brisbane, Australia, one of the things that I so enjoyed about it were the stories, what was happening in the South Pacific, what was happening in Australia, what was happening in New Zealand, some really great climate action efforts going on at the regional level or the local level, or there were nonprofits, and you all know this, doing amazing work. And one of the places I hung out with a lot in Glasgow, I went there every day for my free cup of coffee, was an international coalition of organizations working on wind energy. And I sat in on their sessions and learned about wind projects that are happening all over the world. And again, very encouraging. So when we look at the negotiations, we need to I say this to my students, ultimately any international agreement is voluntary. I mean, and you're up against individual self-interest or national self-interest, and sovereignty issues. So to get the world to come together and actually cooperate is a challenging task, but it often is going to respond to a lot of public pressure. And that public pressure will play out differently in China than it will in the United States, or it will in European Union countries, or in Brazil or India, but it can still be there. And I think that's why I've been impressed that the climate reality effort has been truly global. And I applaud all of you for being part of it. I think it's an amazing organization, and we hope that Vice President Gore lives to be about 120. Anyway, so I forgot to tell you that if you go to one of these things, there's a lot happening besides the negotiations, side events, exhibits, and they're really fun to hang out with, meet people, a lot of networking, a lot of business card exchange.
So Egypt is going to be focused on loss and damage, it sounds like, from what the Egyptians have said.
Yeah.
Any other, I mean, what else should we be looking for the next the next few years when it comes to COP negotiations and intercessions?
I think there's still going to be a lot of attention to climate finance. There, obviously, I think one of the biggest things is how do you increase countries' commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And then I think the other one is just better funding for adaptation. I gave a seminar to a group of people in Bangladesh in September, and by the way, I'm happy to send you the YouTube link to this. It's all been recorded. I gave it on a new phenomenon that I think is important in the United States as well, and that is a concept called locally led adaptation. And when you look at that program that Bees and Bears up in North Idaho, you look at that, as I looked at it, it's about, again, local adaptation. And that's what I'm really into: capacity building at the local level, governance, participation, stakeholder engagement, that kind of thing. But I think we're going to spend more time on adaptation and funding for adaptation. Technology transfer is a big deal. I think we're going to continue to spend time on carbon issues. But yeah, I think those, and climate finance is always going to be there. I don't think we'll spend as much time on deforestation because a lot of progress has been made there. There'll be some of that. There's still going to be some issues related to how often you have to report progress. But I think there's going to be a lot of attention put on countries to say, we're just not, our mitigation targets aren't good enough. We've got to be more aggressive in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I think the negotiations will be influenced in part by what the climate scientists tell us in the next few months. But those are some of the things.
And then, do you think with this sort of, it feels very incremental, these negotiations, will that incremental change, when might there be incremental change to change coal from phase down to phase out? Could that possibly happen in Egypt? Or are we looking at, 10 more years before India and Australia agree to phase out coal?
Boy, that's a wonderful question. I honestly don't know. I'm reminded, I know this is kind of maybe an inappropriate analogy, but I remember the Camp David talks when Jimmy Carter was president. And if you followed the agreement between Israel and Egypt in reaching a peace agreement, which was monumental, if you followed that, we gave a chunk of money to Egypt. They got it. And of course, we've always been a strong supporter of Israel with foreign aid, but we bumped up our foreign aid to Egypt big time. And that wasn't the only reason that Egypt agreed to meet with Israel, but it helped. I think that's going to be a factor if we're able to, and I don't know where the money comes from, but if India has an incentive to phase out coal quicker, I think it will do that. Now, it made a commitment to phase everything out to be carbon neutral by 2070, which is a big deal that even they made any commitment at all. But a lot of people are saying that's we can't wait that long. So I don't know. You're always up against national self-interest. And I'll add one other thing, and I know I'm chatting too much, but I would also I think we as climate reality leaders need to pay attention closely to the Sustainable Development Goals. It may not matter in the US. We don't link the two much, the Sustainable Development Goals and climate change. But when you work in developing countries, those two, climate policy and Sustainable Development Goal policy, are so strongly connected. Because the countries that are developing want to develop. Bangladesh is moving out of the least developed country group into a higher economic group, and they're thrilled with it. I mean, and again, if you're a political leader in any of these countries, you want to do what you can to improve the livelihoods of the people in your country. And that means we need to encourage countries to continue to develop economically. But how do we do that in a sustainable way, a way that is not exploiting natural resources, increasing risks from climate change? And so a lot of developing countries will say, you know what, we need to pay closer attention to the connections. And of course, the 13th, number 13 in the 17 Sustainable Development Goals is climate action. But the Sustainable Development Goals are fundamentally about reducing poverty and improving health. And by the way, that's another thing I will say about Glasgow. Because of the pandemic, the links between public health and climate crisis are out there more prominently than I've ever seen before. And I think that's a good thing. You know, I think, again, I think we have to talk with people about the issues that matter to them, their kids, their grandkids, their livelihoods, their health. And when we link the climate crisis to that, we get their attention and they start to think we better elect people to Congress and to our state houses and our county commissions who care about this issue, regardless of their political party.
So I know we're
my
coming.
apologies. I get carried away on these issues.
No, that's great. And I have one more question, actually. I know that we're getting towards the end of our hour here, but so sometimes the COPs and the UN, frankly, feels very distant and very foreign to to Idahoans. How do international climate negotiations, how do we feel how do Idahoans feel more impacted by what's happening in Glasgow and Egypt and Madrid? How can we make those negotiations feel more relative and important to people here in Idaho?
Well, you're asking some of the absolute best and most challenging questions. I really appreciate that. I think it comes down to doing things like seeing if the Idaho Statesman or the Idaho Free Press would produce an op-ed from one of us where we address that issue and we say that we might think that what happens in Glasgow or Madrid or wherever is distant, but the issues that they're talking about are issues that matter to us. Loss and damage is a good example of it, maybe not using that language, or adaptation. And when we think about how does the climate crisis affect us? Well, it affects us if we're concerned about our agricultural seasons and our farmers being able to get the water that they need, or the tourism industry or the ski areas getting the snowpack that they need. And the decisions that are made in Glasgow where countries commit to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, so that's one way. But the other, I think, is looking at the local economy. Idaho and Oregon, I mean, my youngest son works for Pacific Corp. And what does he do? Well, he's a senior analyst. So he works with state public utility commissions and obviously public utilities. And they do a lot of forecasting. What is the energy mix for Idaho 20 years out, or Oregon or Washington? He was telling me the other day that Wyoming lives in a different world than the state of Washington. Wyoming still wants coal to be a big part of its energy mix, but gradually he's seeing in some of the discourse out of Wyoming that they're starting to recognize that they have tremendous potential when it comes to solar and wind. So what about solar and wind? Well, there are jobs. And I mean, this is what Biden administration says, Gore says it. If we think about the Idaho economy in 20 years, how can renewable energy play into that in terms of jobs where you can go to Treasure Valley Community College, or you can go to Southern Idaho College and you go through a 2-year program where you get trained as a solar energy technician or a wind energy technician, and those jobs are going to pay well. And they're going to be jobs with us for a long, long time because while coal runs out, wind and sun will not, hopefully. So I think part of it is to relate what happens in Glasgow. Yeah, those issues may seem distant, or the negotiations, but the issues themselves have a local presence. That's what I often try to do. And then the other part of this is, there's a friend of mine who's a retired professor at Portland State, and he's been at our climate reality meetings in Oregon. He has done something, started a program, and I could send you the link, watch parties. So in Portland, for example, he would organize a group of people just at a community center and say, who wants to sit with me and watch some of this? Because some of this stuff is live streamed, and there are obviously time zone issues, but he'll get a group of people together and say, let's watch this plenary session and then talk about your perception of it, and I'll try to explain it. So people are doing watch parties, that kind of boring, I think, in some ways, but works for some. I think more important is for us as climate reality leaders to try to relate what happens in these UN meetings to what issues matter to us locally. That's what I try to do.
Okay. Well, Dr. Walker, thank you very much for taking your time, your lunch here to meet with all of us and
Sure.
Educate us about COP26 and international climate negotiations. I'm going to send around the slides and this video to all our members because I know there'll be a lot of interest in them. So we really appreciate you taking the time, and thanks so much.
Let me ask one question, everybody who's on. Is anybody, and Rob, you talked about a family coming to visit. Is anybody traveling, getting on a plane over the holidays?
Our daughter is actually going to fly back to New York City on the 26th of December.
Okay, well, the reason why I say that is that I have been getting on airplanes lately, and I have found it to be very safe. I have felt very comfortable. People are, I mean, you see these news reports, but every flight I've been on, people are wearing masks. They're being very conscientious at the airport. And I just say that because it is, at least my experience has been, they've created a pretty good bubble. When I flew to Europe, I had to show my vaccination card and I had to fill out a locator form. I went to Hawaii and I had to do a PCR test. But if you have to get on a plane, and again, we don't know what's going to happen with the Omicron variation, but I have felt very comfortable. I've been saying that to a lot of friends of mine who are my age, and they're reluctant to get on a plane. But I found outside of the airport, it might be a different world, but at least within the airport experience and the plane experience has been pretty good.
That's great.
Well, I appreciate everybody staying with me and letting me run off at the mouth about this. And if you want to find out any more about any of these things, just give me a holler. I think my email address is in the slides. Happy to chat with you on the phone or Zoom. And then we can all share stories about our climate reality experiences. And I keep forgetting to document mine. I got to update my file to say what I'm doing. But then again, it's like a line on the Vita that I forget to include. So.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and everyone else, thanks also for joining today.
Thanks.
And hello, fellow ex-Minnesotan.
Rob is too.
Oh, wow. Whereabouts in Minnesota?
I was born and raised in Austin.
Oh yeah, great town. Patty, how about you? Are you
Twin Cities, St. Paul.
whereabouts? I'm a Richfield guy.
Okay.
And
What's St. Paul?
oh yeah, and I'm a couple degrees from University of Minnesota. A long time ago when dinosaurs walked the earth.
Me too.
Awesome.
Take care, everyone, and best wishes for a healthy and happy holiday to you and your family.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you all.